The morning mist drifted lazily across Mirror Lake, its silver tendrils dancing between the cattails that swayed gently in the cool breeze. Marcus sat on the weathered wooden dock, his reflection rippling in the dark water below. At 28, he carried the weight of countless comparisons on his shoulders, each one a stone that had been added over the years until he could barely remember what it felt like to walk without their burden. His phone buzzed softly beside him. Another notification from social media. Another glimpse into lives that seemed perfectly curated, effortlessly successful, endlessly fulfilling. He didn't pick it up. Instead, he watched a blue jay land on a nearby branch, its feathers catching the early sunlight that filtered through the ancient oak trees surrounding the lake. "You're here early today." The gentle voice belonged to Samuel, an elderly man who lived in the small cabin across the water. Marcus had been coming to this secluded spot for months, seeking solace in its quietude, and Samuel had become a familiar presence. The old man moved with the deliberate grace of someone who had learned that rushing through life meant missing its most precious moments. "Couldn't sleep," Marcus replied, his voice barely above a whisper. "Had another one of those nights where my mind wouldn't stop racing." Samuel lowered himself onto the dock beside Marcus, his weathered hands folding peacefully in his lap. The wooden planks creaked softly under their combined weight, a sound that somehow added to the morning's serenity rather than disturbing it. "Racing. Toward what?" Samuel asked, though his tone suggested he already understood. Marcus let out a long, slow breath. "Everyone else's finish line, I suppose. My college roommate just bought his second house. My sister got another promotion. My neighbor started a business that's already more successful than anything I've ever attempted." He picked up a smooth stone from the dock and turned it over in his palm. "Sometimes I wonder if I'm the only person who feels like they're standing still while the whole world moves forward." The water lapped gently against the shore, creating a rhythmic melody that seemed to slow time itself. A family of ducks glided past, leaving V-shaped wakes that gradually faded back into stillness. Samuel watched them with the patient attention of someone who had learned to find meaning in simple moments. "You know," Samuel said eventually, "I spent 40 years of my life convinced I was running the wrong race." Marcus turned to look at the older man, noting the deep lines around his eyes that spoke of both laughter and sorrow, triumph and disappointment. Samuel's hair was silver white, and his clothes were simple but well cared for, suggesting a life lived with intention rather than excess. "I was a teacher," Samuel continued, his voice carrying the cadence of someone who had told stories to countless students over the decades. "Started when I was 22, fresh out of college, full of dreams about changing the world. But everywhere I looked, my peers were becoming lawyers, doctors, engineers. They were making more money, living in bigger houses, driving newer cars." A gentle breeze stirred the cattails, creating a soft rustling that harmonized with the distant call of a loon somewhere across the lake. Marcus found himself leaning closer, drawn in by the quiet authority in Samuel's voice. "For 20 years, I compared myself to everyone except the one person who mattered, the man I was becoming through my work. I measured my worth by their bank accounts, their possessions, their achievements. I was so busy looking sideways that I never looked forward at the path I was actually walking. What changed?" Marcus asked, setting the stone aside and giving Samuel his full attention. Samuel smiled, and Marcus could see decades of hard-won wisdom in that expression. A student named Jenny. She was in my 8th grade English class, quiet as a mouse, always sitting in the back corner. Her family didn't have much, and she wore the same 3 outfits in rotation. The other kids didn't pay her much attention. The old man paused, watching as a dragonfly skimmed across the water's surface, its wings creating tiny ripples that caught the strengthening sunlight. One day, Jenny stayed after class. She handed me a story she'd written, just 3 pages, about a lonely tree that learned to appreciate its own unique shape instead of wishing it looked like the other trees in the forest. It was beautiful, Marcus, raw and honest, and full of a wisdom that took my breath away. Marcus felt something shift inside his chest, a loosening of the tight knots he'd carried there for so long. She told me that my class was the first place where she'd ever felt safe to share her thoughts. That for 1 hour each day, she forgot about all the things she didn't have and remembered all the things she did have. Her words, her imagination, her ability to see beauty in the smallest moments. Samuel's voice grew softer, more reverent. That's when I realized I'd been measuring success with the wrong ruler. The sun had climbed higher now, burning away the last of the morning mist and revealing the lake in all its pristine glory. Marcus could see clear to the bottom in the shallow areas near the shore, where small fish darted between submerged logs and smooth stones. I started paying attention to the real outcomes of my work, Samuel continued, the shy student who found her voice through poetry, the angry teenager who learned to channel his emotions into creative writing, the class clown who discovered he could make people laugh with stories instead of disruptions. He turned to face Marcus directly. I realized I wasn't behind anyone else. I was exactly where I was supposed to be, doing exactly what I was meant to do. Marcus felt tears prick at the corners of his eyes. But how do you stop the comparisons? How do you quiet that voice that keeps telling you you're not enough? You don't silence it, Samuel said gently. You learn to respond to it differently. When that voice starts listing all the ways you fall short, you remind it of all the ways you show up. When it points to someone else's success, you point to your own growth. When it whispers that you're behind, you remember that life isn't a race with a single finish line. It's a journey with as many destinations as there are people walking it. A fish jumped in the distance, creating concentric circles that spread outward until they reached the shore at their feet. Marcus watched those ripples and thought about all the small impacts he'd made that he'd never bothered to measure. The coworker he'd helped through a difficult project. The neighbor whose groceries he carried when she was recovering from surgery. The phone calls to his parents that brightened their quiet evenings. The truth is, Samuel said, standing and brushing off his pants, comparison is just fear wearing a disguise. We're afraid we don't matter, so we try to prove we do by measuring ourselves against others. But mattering isn't relative, Marcus. Your worth isn't determined by how you stack up against anyone else. It's determined by how fully you become who you're meant to be. As Samuel walked away, Marcus remained on the dock, feeling something he hadn't experienced in years, a deep, abiding sense of peace with exactly where he was. The sun warmed his face, the water lapped gently at the shore, and for the first time, in longer than he could remember, He wasn't thinking about being anywhere else or anyone else. He was simply, completely, authentically himself, and that was more than enough.